I'm Matt.
And I'm Jonny.
And this is our van. It's a Volkswagen Transporter T5 and we're converting it into the ultimate small camper van.
It's only little, so we're being sure to use every inch to maximise the space we have.
But don't worry, the process we show you in this series will work for any van, no matter the size or shape.
So let's get on with it. So the first stage of any van conversion is choosing the right van for you.
And there are a number of factors that are going to affect your decision.
Like if you're planning to live in this full time or just for weekends away.
And will it be your main method of transport that you use for the daily commute, or is it just a second vehicle?
While a bigger van with a high roof and a long wheelbase will be perfect if you plan to live in it full time, this van is just going to be used for weekends away and it is our main method of transport. So we wanted something a little bit smaller, easier to drive around and a bit more fuel efficient.
So after much looking around online, we finally found this beautiful little VW Transporter. We did spend some time looking at some other smaller vans, but ultimately we went for the VW as they're solid, reliable and they hold their value super well.
The previous owner had already partly converted the van, so it did have carpeted walls and a plywood floor.
However, we wanted to do the whole thing ourselves, so we gutted it all back to the bare metal and then we kicked things off with the stud work. So for this part of the build, you're only going to need a few basic tools. Ideally, a jigsaw, a drill, a planer, a mallet and a chisel. We also find that a pair of SuperJaws are unbelievably handy with the whole conversion process, as it means that we don't have to keep walking back and forth from the workshop every time we need to clamp something up. We just have them at the back of the van set up at all times.
So essentially we're going to clad the internal walls of the van, and to do this we're going to create an internal structure made of timber. We could screw directly into the metal, but there are some points where we don't have that and it's going to be a lot easier if we have some timber to screw directly into. So no matter what van you have, the approach is going to be exactly the same. You're just looking for little bits of overhanging metal that you can screw into that isn't the outside shell of the van, obviously, because you don't want to screw into the outside face. So back here we've already started doing some of the structural stuff, and you can see we've used some of the gaps and holes already in the van, and we've created some little notches in the timber and then screwed through the metalwork to lock it in place. Back here we've also put some battens behind with wedges in place using some adhesive, in our case that's Sikaflex, and that way that makes this whole structure really solid and we can screw directly into that for our cladding. So the plan now is to do the same thing as we've done here around the rest of the van, using any little nooks and crannies we can find and creating a little timber substructure that the cladding will go onto. Let's crack on. You can see here that we're essentially just cutting the wood to size and then shaping it to fit all of the odd little curves and shapes that you find in the van. There's no hard and fast rule for this, it's just a case of removing material bit by bit until you manage to get it to fit nicely.
As long as you've got a close enough fit here, then you're all good. It doesn't have to be super refined, as it's all going to get covered up eventually.
We're then chiseling out notches in these vertical battens where the horizontals are going to go. In our case, we only have to do this on the left-hand side, as the right has these little notches in the metal that we can use.
When it comes to screwing to the metalwork, some people prefer to use a self-drilling screw. However, we just like to use a regular old wood screw and then being sure to drill a pilot hole first.
To ensure you're drilling the correct size pilot hole, check that the drill bit size you're using is the same as the shaft of the screw, which is the part that doesn't have any threads.
We're also using adhesive on all of these joints, as not only will it make a stronger joint, but it'll also reduce the chances of anything rattling around and making a super annoying noise while you're driving.
The next step is to get the battens up on the roof.
In our case, there's a load of this foam up on the roof of the van. We figured there's no need to get rid of it as it's not actually doing any harm, so instead we just made some channels so we could get a really nice bond between the battens and the metalwork for a really good seal.
is a really quick and simple process. Just run a bead of sealant where you want it and hold the batten in place.
Once we had a set done, we set up this little makeshift clamping method to hold them in place while we moved on to the next set.
Next, we're moving on to the floor structure. Now, you don't have to insulate your floor, and many people opt to skip this step, especially in low roof vans, to save losing any head height. However, we decided to go for it, not just to help control the temperature better inside the van, but also to reduce noise and to give us a nice solid surface to start building things off.
Now we're just laying down our battens in a grid formation that we've already cut to size. Like we said earlier, you can be quite rough with this, as it's not going to be seen once it's all covered up.
Similar to the roof, we're using adhesive to stick the floor battens down, mainly because we didn't want to have a load of screws poking through the bottom of the van.
Now, if you're working on a high top van, we'd recommend insulating your floor with something like a 25mm PIR board. However, we're wanting to save as much of that head height as possible, so instead we're going with the 10mm foam insulation boards.
A nice easy way that we found to measure each of these awkward spaces was to push the foam into place, and that would push a little indent into the foam from the wood battens, which you could use as a cutting guide for your knife.
This stuff cuts really nicely. When we're cutting it, we go slightly oversized to make sure it's a really nice snug fit. Where there are no ribs on the floor, we're adding in these additional spacer pieces just to prevent the foam from bending too much.
To fix them in place, we're using some contact adhesive. You spray it on both sides, wait a few minutes, and then push it into place. You may have noticed this big van vault that we've got installed in the back of the van. This is something that we installed a little while back, and it's going to play a key part of our van build. So we'll be showing you how we installed that in an upcoming video on how we're going to build our camper van bed.
Next, you want to look at sound deadening. Now, there are loads of different options out there, so you just want to take a look around and see what fits your price point. These are heavy duty panels that you want to stick onto areas of the van that have a high vibration risk, which are essentially any large surfaces of sheet metal.
They're super easy to install. It's just a case of cleaning any grease or dirt from the surface, peeling off the back layer and sticking them in place.
Now's a good point to lay out where you want your electrics to go, and a good way of doing this is by using Conduit. This allows you to go back and add more wires later on if you need to. If this is your first conversion, then we definitely recommend doing this step, as there's a good chance you'll think of something later on that you want to add.
We're running Conduit through the metal ducting where we can to keep it hidden away, and then having it end up roughly where we want each appliance. The type of things we're going to be running in our van are a roof vent, a cooler, some lighting and some plug sockets.
Now, the electrics were the one part of the build where we thought it really would help to have someone who knows exactly what they're doing to help out. So we called in the help of our good friend Hugh to sort it out. He's done some really nice tutorials on how to install electrics over on his channel, so we'll leave a link for those in the description below. But if you do end up doing these yourself, we really recommend getting a professional to have a look through once you're done to make sure everything's working okay.
Now we're moving on to the wall and ceiling insulation. And this is really a key section if you want to have any sort of enjoyable space inside your van, no matter how long you plan to spend in it. Not only will it help keep your van warm in colder weather, it will help keep it cool when it's hot outside.
Now, there are a load of different materials and methods out there, so we've just gone with the one that we think is the most straightforward without compromising the effectiveness of the installation.
For all of the larger, flatter spaces, especially the walls, the ceiling and the doors, we're going for PIR board. This has a really good thermal conductivity value and is really easy to work with.
However, as the van is by no means square, there's still going to be loads of little awkward areas where PIR board isn't suitable. So for those, we're using this recycled plastic loft insulation. It doesn't insulate quite as well as a PIR board, which is why we're not using it for the whole van, but it is really soft and easy to work with, and it means you can stuff it into all those little nooks and crannies. Plus, it's recycled, so that's always a big bonus.
Next, we're moving over to the PIR boards and we're cutting them down to size to fit all of the panelled areas. As a general rule, we recommend 50mm PIR board for the walls and doors and 25mm for the ceiling and floors. But the floors are the lowest priority, so you can drop this down if you need to, like we're doing in our case.
Once again, we're cutting these slightly oversized and then securing them in place with some contact adhesive. The foil surface of these boards acts as a vapour barrier to prevent the moisture in the air on the inside of the van from coming into contact with the cold metal and forming condensation. And once it's all in place, we're covering up all of those seams with foil tape to complete that vapour barrier. One thing you'll need to be careful of throughout the whole insulation process is that you're not blocking access to anywhere that you'll need to get to later on, such as the rear lights.
The last stage of this part of the build is to add a final vapour barrier to cover all of the walls and ceiling, and for this we're using a double bubble foil insulation. We installed this using spray glue and foil tape. Doing this seals the entire van and reduces your risk of condensation, as well as adds an extra layer of insulation.
So this foil insulation works best if there's a slight air gap either side of it. Obviously there will be areas where this isn't possible, so it's not crucial, but it's just something to bear in mind when you're applying it.
You'll find installing this is fairly easy on the flat sections, however the corners can be a little bit tricky. So just take care and make sure you're trying to push it right into the corners to avoid having to cut it later on.
So there you go, that is your van all prepped and ready to go.
This is kind of the slow and slightly tedious part of the whole conversion, so it's quite a big relief once that's done and out of the way.
But it is a super important part of the build, and all of your hard work and effort here will really pay off at the end.
In our next video, we're going to be showing you how to line and clad the inside of your van, and that's when it really starts to take shape.
Very exciting.
Oh my God.
See you on the next one.